Okay, good evening, everyone. We are going to get started with this session about the data retention update. Imagine a world where your emails, your phone conversations, IP addresses, basically all metadata about your communication is being stored for 6 months. What do you think the implications are going to be? These 3 people, Ralph, Patrick, and Rikke, will tell you more about it, and they will give you detailed information what data retention means. They will also give you information about state of the things, where are we right now, and also what kind of resistance has built and what they are doing. Please welcome them.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for coming in these big numbers at this late hour. The Data Retention Directive, the European Union Data Retention Directive, has been passed by the European Parliament a bit more than a year ago. And I think in May it entered into force as official European Union law. So what we will try to do here is tell you a bit, for those who haven't heard about it before, what data retention is, about the directive, what's in it, what it means, and about what has happened on the national level so far. We're going to have a case study presented by Rikke on Denmark, because Denmark is pretty advanced in this implementation on the national level. And we're going to tell you about how people have fought and are still fighting against this thing, politically, technically, and legally. Okay, so very quickly, some questions, just for meditating a bit. Is there one more? I'm not sure, no. So these are all questions some people, probably from the police or something, could ask you in the future if this directive is implemented in your country. Current EU data protection legislation, or at least the old school good one, so to speak, says internet service providers and telecom providers have to delete all data they don't need for billing. So if you have an internet flat rate, a DSL flat rate, they only need your account number maybe if they get the money directly from your account, and they need your address and your phone number maybe. But they don't need to know whom you sent an email, which websites you visited. They don't even have to know when you went online and for how long and how much traffic how much bandwidth you used. There was actually a court decision in Germany about a year ago where a customer from German Telecom sued German Telecom because he had a flat rate and they still stored his IP number, a dynamic IP number he was assigned, and he won. So now Telecom has to delete his IP numbers immediately. And law enforcement agencies, of course, don't like this idea. They want as much data as they can get, and for a couple of years, they've been asking for mandatory storage of communications data for several years. And the basic idea behind this is we don't even go behind specific suspects or criminals. We just want to have everybody's data stored, so just in case we might need it later. I mean, anybody could turn into a terrorist in the future, and we might want to know whom he called 6 months ago and from where. So the EU directive specifies which data is to be retained, and the retaining party, the party where this data is stored, is your provider, your telephone provider or your internet provider or your email provider. So generally, they have to store data that is generated and processed in dealing with you, your user ID, your name and address, if available, date, time, length of communication, even unsuccessful call attempts. If you call somebody and they don't answer, they still have to store it. And so this is basically for all services. For fixed line telephony, data of caller and called person, of course. It also includes voicemail, call forwarding, conference calls, and so on. For mobile telephony, if you have a prepaid card, they have to store the date, time, and cell ID, which means basically the location where the prepaid card was activated for the first time. And if you have a normal contract with your mobile phone provider, they have to store for each call you make your cell ID and location, your subscriber identification, and your equipment identification. For internet access, email, and voice over IP, they have to store your IP number you got assigned, the phone number if you do dial-up access through a modem, and the internet service used, mail or voice over IP. It doesn't say web traffic, HTTP or something like that. We come back to that later. So the directive, the EU directive, doesn't say anything about content retention. The providers are not mandated to store the content of your text messages from your mobile phone or your email bodies or even the email subjects. They must not store URLs, and you still can use prepaid mobile phone cards. You can use anonymous email providers and go to an internet cafe without having to show your government-issued ID. But there's some movement in these corners, which Patrick will go into detail later. There's also no ban of anonymization services yet, like Tor or JAP. But there is, in Germany, for example, an attempt at the moment to make them store all the data that goes through their nodes. So this is the directive. Member states, of course, say, okay, we transpose the directive into a national law in order to make it a law on the national level, but we do some add-ons. You know, we extend the scope of the data. Retention period in the directive is minimum 6 months, maximum 2 years. And then there's a national extension possible if the EU Commission, so a member state of the European Union, a government can notify the Commission and say, we have a special crisis here in country XYZ. There's really, really bad terrorists here, and we need to get after them, and whatever. And there also were bad terrorists here like 3 years ago, so we need to have data stored for 3 years and not 2 years. And they just send this letter to the Commission. If the Commission doesn't answer the letter within 6 months or so, it's automatically approved. Poland wanted 15 years in the beginning. Scary shit. So the question then is, who gets access to this data once it's stored with the provider? It's not some government database, it's still your provider, your telephone provider, your internet provider. This is regulated in national laws. The directive only says government agencies can only access this data in specific cases, so they don't get the full database dump. But it's not really clear if this is for serious crimes only. In Germany, the draft bill that was published a few months ago says it's for serious crimes, but also for any crimes committed online.
These are all, unfortunately,
Well,
statistics from the United States, so I'm sorry.
music industry, I hear you.
To comparable European
The transmission of this data to the law enforcement agencies and so on has to be done without undue delay, according to the directive. That could mean remote access. We have these cases with interception by intelligence agencies.
But at any rate, so then
And the directive says the data is only to be given to competent national authorities. Who might that be?
only 27% of them. So this was
So, implementation.
out as sort of women's
The member states of the European Union now have time until 15th September next year to implement this for telephone data and until 15th March 2009 for internet data if they announced a reservation on internet data in the council meeting, EU council meeting when the directive was adopted. But of course they can implement it earlier, no problem.
participation in technology as a social issue and women's participation as a response to social
Yeah, in Germany,
in the United
as I said, we have a draft now, a draft law, and according to this, email providers and web anonymizers have to retain customer data and IP number. So if I register a free email account somewhere with gmx.de or something, GMX has to ask for my name, my address, maybe even my date of birth or something like that. Of course, you might still be able to just fill in some bullshit, you know, but if you heard the speech before here by Caspar Bowden from Microsoft about the identity management system and so on, and maybe the speech of Jan, Udo and myself earlier this afternoon about identity management, there are some things that, you know, in the end might join, and GMX might maybe by law be forced to only give you an email account for free if you show a government-issued identity card. Anyhow, and web anonymizers still can, in a way, work like an anonymizing proxy between you and a website you want to visit, but they now have to retain all the data. So it's not really anonymous in terms of if the government wants access to it.
And then as a comparison,
yeah, this is Germany. In other countries, there have been data retention laws already before this directive was passed, so they are now working on changing them. For example, in the Netherlands, they only had a data retention law that applied to prepaid mobile phones, and they only had retention periods of 3 months. Everything else was not retained. Ireland has had 3 years of retention. They now have to go down to 2 years. That's why they're challenging this in the European Court of Justice. And Denmark, as I said, is pretty advanced because they've already had a law, and they even have an implementation order now. And Reke is going to talk about this a bit more in detail.
For like some sugar on top of your statistics, because you can never have enough statistics. I just wanted to add that there was this very interesting study in the late 90s by the Swedish Medical Research Council.
Thank you.
That showed that women
Thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be back in Berlin.
in order to get grants and financial support.
This is still
So
you,
again, what
Ralph.
we're seeing is a kind of social problem around women.
You missed one slide, but
succeeding in
anyhow.
their fields.
Okay, I'll talk a bit about the status of data retention in Denmark,
To look at the big picture and to see where women are
and then we will finish off with a bit about the European opposition to data retention and what we can do next, and maybe we can, in the discussion, touch upon which role some of you here at CCC can play in this.
where you see 0.0%.
Actually, in Denmark, the whole issue of data retention goes back till June 2002, where we had our first anti-terror law adopted with data retention as one element for 1 year.
You would expect to see if the issue
It was traffic data, it was not content data, but it was at that moment unclear to which extent it would be only email communication or whether it would also encompass web traffic browsing data.
specifically a social trend.
It's to be used for investigation and prosecution of criminal acts. That's a pretty general statement. But if you then look into another piece of legislation, which is actually our Administration of Justice Act, which basically regulates how you can get access to communication data, then you see that it's only for crimes that are worth 6 years or more in prison. So compared to, for instance, the current draft in Germany, this is a relatively high crime status. The anti-terror law was adopted more than 4 years ago. The executive order, as Ralph just said, was only adopted in September this year. So actually more than 4 years passed since we had the mandate in our anti-terror law and until we actually have data retention as a reality. And it's still not implemented. Now we have the executive order, but the ISPs actually have until next fall to get the technical equipment into place. So before they will actually start to retain the data.
In other words, how do we make
And as said earlier, it implements the EU directive of February this year. If we look back at the process over the last 4 years, there was a very strong opposition in Denmark when the first draft on data retention was presented. Actually, it was a bit ironic because the anti-terror law with the data retention provision was rushed through Parliament, and there was very little opposition at that point.